Hi everyone, I'm Wendi News, creator of the LeftPOC Project, which seeks to bring you the history of leftists of color, one swipe at a time. And this is the LeftPOC Project podcast. Before we get started with today's episode, I wanted to do a little housekeeping. First, if you're enjoying the podcast, please do not forget to rate and review us on iTunes. Also, be sure to follow us on social media if you don't already by searching for LeftPOC. Finally, be sure to check out our Patreon page where everything is always free to the public and where we accept donations to help keep the podcast running. With your support, we are able to pay for web storage and basic podcast needs, but also to keep our unique system going in which we not only provide a small payment as a token of thanks to our guests, but where we also make a donation on their behalf to the organization of their choice in order to provide support to the community. We also support other leftist podcasts as a means of expressing our gratitude for the hard work that they're putting into the process of making ideology that recognizes humanity one that is all the more pervasive. And speaking of ideology that recognizes humanity, let's get on with the show. Today's episode is a Reading Revolution segment, our series where we read and discuss work written by and or that inspired leftists of color. For this episode, we discuss the Combahee River Collective Statement from 1977. The Combahee River Collective was a group of Black lesbian socialists who met in Boston over the course of several years to discuss social issues and means of organizing their communities. The collective was named after a particular mission led by Harriet Tubman at the Combahee River that resulted in the freedom of over 750 slaves. While a fairly large group, which shifted in size during its years in operation, some of its most notable members include Barbara Smith, Demita Frazier, and Audre Lorde. These women activists and thinkers initially came together in 1974 out of frustration with the Black movement and the women's movement for their discrimination toward and failures to address the needs of women like themselves. Building upon the work of radical Black women who had come before them, including abolitionists and socialists alike, this collective of women is most famously known for coining the term identity politics, which has unfortunately been distorted beyond recognition by people left, right, and center in the present. Though the group disbanded in 1980, the women who were part of it remain politically active and continue their fight for human rights. This episode is to discuss their manifesto, reclaim the original intentions behind it, and consider how their seminal work can be applied into a better future. As always, please be sure to check out the show notes for readings and resources about the Combahee River Collective, including the statement we discussed in the episode. Hey, Richard. How's it going? I'm afraid to ask this question.
Right. It's dangerous. Things have been mostly well for me, so as well as they can be given the conditions anyway. So
yeah, I think it'll. Yeah, no, that's my response. Just like my brain melts. Yeah, I'm doing okay, I guess. But I don't know. I think this reading this time around was pretty fitting considering everything that's going on. I think all of our readings have been fitting, so I shouldn't say like this is some sort of, special thing that's different from the others. But it's interesting kind of watching all of the movement work going on and then the incredibly draconian and like overreaching disproportionate response to that work by the police and by the state. And then to be reading something like this, the Combahee River Collective Statement, where these women are talking about everyday oppression and what they're trying to do and how they're trying to come together to at least discuss and name the oppressions they're facing and ways to address it. It's kind of nice to think about the earlier stages of things like intersectionality, things like, the movement work that's done by the Movement for Black Lives or Black Lives Matter and all of the offshoots that have come out since. And also just to kind of see, in particular, the ongoing work that Black queer women are doing in these sorts of spaces. I think a lot about, a lot of the sort of mutual aid and mutual aid collectives that have been popping up as of late. And a lot of them are led by Black women, and in particular Black queer women in many cases. And so it's kind of fascinating to read, you know, the sort of history behind the kind of work we're seeing now by the same types of women from the 70s. So I don't know, I think it's kind of like a reverb of sorts historically.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think what is consistently, I guess, a bit surprising or impressive is just how fitting and how timely these pieces that we read are, considering the when they were written, often 40, 60 years ago sometimes, so like, or even longer. And to see the applicability and the, I guess, resonance of today's situation in these types of readings is always just leaves an impression. And so I think this was another one that is both timely for the kind of general conversation that's going on in the what's happening in the world, but also for me personally, it speaks to a lot of the kind of concerns, questions, and curiosities I had about how we got to where we're at now. And so I think that it's a lot of interesting. There's a lot of interesting stuff packed in a very relatively short piece here.
Yeah, like if you print it, because I put it into a Google Doc, it's about 11 pages. It's not that long at all. And so, and you and I talked about this a bit off air, but it's something that's come up with some of our other readings as well. But like the way that when you read it, it seems like a given in some ways, right? Go ahead and talk about that, because you mentioned this, and it's something that like I felt as well.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it seems like very enlightened and wise in its content, but at the same time, it's you look at it and you're like, well, duh, right? This is what was been obvious and has been in no, I guess, minced words, been kind of told to us several times, and it seems as though it's just so hard for us to listen sometimes. And so, like, just knowing, like, seeing it, that it's one of these things that has been being said for decades, as a lot of the readings that we've had has been a realization for me, is that the feelings and the observations that I've been having about society are actually feelings and observations that people in similar situations have been having for decades. And it's not a matter of those things not being expressed. It's a matter of those expressions not being heard. And so this is just kind of serves to reinforce that perception that I've had.
And it's fascinating too, because like obviously the statement itself gets at that, right? Like they talk about, you know, why they don't feel like they're being heard. And this is from the 70s. So imagine, you know, these poor women now looking at the situation, and we're saying the same things, you know, like we're still not being heard. We're still having issues. It must be kind of frustrating for them, to say the least, because most of them are still alive. I think maybe a few of them may have passed, but most of them are still alive and incredibly politically active. You know, Barbara Smith she was part of the Sanders campaign pretty prominently. And it's weird because she was sort of, I'm frustrated by how they ended up doing the interview and the discussion with her, because it came on the heels of the Joe Rogan endorsement and how they sort of made a big deal out of that. And I was like, you know, to get the audience that they really want, the sort of voters that they really want, they should be emphasizing the connections that they've made with women like this, Black women in their 50s and 60s who, you know, were part of social movements of the past and involved in social movements now still. And they were kind of sleeping on that connection, and sort of, it felt almost like an afterthought, or a sort of damage control moment to me, which is unfortunate, because I think if they had foregrounded these connections with women like this, I think they would have attracted, perhaps, maybe not certainly, but perhaps attracted more of an audience, like those women, right? Like older Black women that they really needed to vote for them, to kind of get them to secure the nomination. But that's a discussion for another time. But I do think, that what's interesting about this, like building on what you were saying, is that on the one hand, it's frustrating that you're like, oh my God, they've been saying this forever, and we still have the same problems, or very similar problems, right? And it's concerning and frustrating, that feeling of their having not been heard, right? And our concerns not having been heard, period. But then on the second side of this, right, the other hand, I think it's positive in that
what they say has become common knowledge, right? And it's become like sort of a part of our popular discourse about these issues, about issues of race, gender, class, sexual identity and things like that. It's part of the common vernacular these days, especially movement vernacular. And so in some ways it's just disheartening that we don't feel like they were heard, or they didn't feel like they were being heard, and we still feel like we're not being heard. But on the other hand, it's like this information sort of trickled down, or it spread out. I don't want to say trickle down because that implies that these women were like all upper class and like whatever, and they definitely were not. But it spread out. It spread beyond these moments, these historical moments in which they're writing something like this and having these meetings. Because nowadays, the language that they use and the concerns that they have are commonplace. And it's not something that is isolated and like, just relegated to the history books, but it's something that's a part of our everyday speech and everyday concerns and the articulation of those concerns. So like, and this happens a lot, right? Like a historian or anthropologist may write a book and then doesn't sell that well. And then eventually people start picking it up and using it in a classroom. And then it's sort of, the argument becomes more popularized because people are talking about it. And they may not be citing that person, right? But their idea is spread around. I think of people like Cedric Robinson, who wrote Black Marxism. So many ideas in that book are commonplace and people talk about, but they don't necessarily know that they came from that book, right? And many other texts that we've read. So I think in some ways it's positive that regardless of their not being heard in real time, I think they were heard eventually by virtue of like other women and educators and activists who were spreading this information and encouraging others to at least talk about the issues that they faced.
I know sorry.
No, go ahead. You're fine.
I was just going to say, I know for me personally, another aspect that kind of resonates is that sometimes it's easy to, when I look at some of these prominent figures throughout the civil rights movement and throughout the kind of radical left history, to put them on a pedestal and imagine them as always existing as these like fully formed radical communists or whatever, and just in the statement that they are acknowledging that they're developing and identifying and kind of refining what their politics are and finding them. It's kind of I don't know. I can relate to the idea that it makes me feel like, oh, I don't have to be this already knowing everything. It's okay to be exploring and to be on this process of learning and understanding. And so and even people that rise to be rather prolific figures and have wide impacts have those moments. And so it's something I could relate to.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's like, okay, we're not starting from square one, like we have something to build on, but we're also like engaging in a process that many other people have done before us. And that we're not alone in this like figuring out stage, right? Like trying to figure out what's going on. I just want to also put my motivations out there as to why I decided for us to read this. So you and I both had just done an interview with Delete Your Account, which I will link in the comments or in the show notes, Everyone should check it out. It was great to speak to Kumar's. He's a wonderful interviewer too, like really good at this. And so I feel like that was a really fruitful discussion, but we talked a bit about, some of our concerns on the left, at least the nominal left, the online left, that culture of sorts, and what's been emerging as sort of a rhetoric and a form of talking about the issues that sort of rejects and excludes matters of identity on the one hand, and or is framing everything through like a right-wing lens. So it's as if they're some people on the online left are borrowing issues and concerns from the right and trying to attract people from the right to come to the left. So they're using the language of the right. But the problem is that they're then absorbing the ideology of the right too, and making the right-wing concerns left-wing concerns when they have no place on the left. So like this recent obsession with cancel culture that's come about, so-called cancel culture, because I don't think cancel culture and the way people think it exists. And they've been sort of making that the primary concern. And on a similar note, this concern about, do identity politics bring down the left? And I see an obsession with this idea, and it has been kind of an obsession for a while, but I think it really came to the surface after the 2016 election. And for me, it's always been just a rehashing of the political correctness debates from the 80s and 90s. And then I think a cheap rehashing, in fact, but it's as if people think that it's new. Like, people think cancel culture, whatever they define it as, this new thing, but it's always been a preoccupation of the right. And so I've been trying to figure out why are people on the left kind of taking on this issue when it's not a real thing? And then on top of that, defending people who have immense degrees of power in the process. And so I wanted to read something that dealt with one of the concerns that keeps coming up, which and I see identity politics, this debate over whether identity politics has a place on the left and whether cancel culture is real. I see these two debates as connected, because usually the argument is the people who are talking about identity politics or who are emphasizing their identity are then the ones who subsequently go on to cancel, quote unquote, cancel other people for not being respectful of or, addressing those aspects of their identity. So I've seen the example given, that, if someone gets canceled because they don't use the proper pronouns for someone or the proper racial designation, and then they get upset about it, and then they quote unquote cancel the person who's not using the proper terminology, whatever that means in terms of cancellation, I don't know. But my point here is that I think these two issues are linked, and I think it's important for us to go back and kind of really talk about the original meaning of the term identity politics, because literally Barbara Smith had to record a video the other day. It was during an interview, I believe, where she talked about what identity politics actually means, because so many people have gotten away from the original meaning that it's maddening. And I think it's been an intentional distortion of what these women meant. And so that's why I felt it was really important to go back and actually look at their words, because a lot of what comes up in this very short reading is actually super relevant to movement work on the left today, but sometimes gets sidelined because of people's pre-existing biases, for example, against women like these. So against Black women, against Black people, period, against people of color, period, against women, period, right? So there's some issues in here that definitely, the way they frame it, are important for us to think about now, but in particular for us to hold on to some of the definitions they put out, and how they root them in socialism, which is another really important aspect of this kind of work that these women did that I think gets lost. So we should definitely talk about that, and some of the meanings that they assign, not only to terminology, but aspects of the movements themselves. Because I think, again, that we sometimes get bogged down with these right-wing debates that really don't reflect what should be going on the left, and where our focus should lie, right? Our focus should be on making sure that everyone's okay, and making sure that the system that's making things not okay is dismantled ASAP, or as much as we can possibly do within our lifetimes. Questioned, dismantled, and reshaped into something that we want to see as improving our conditions and improving our world. And I think sometimes people get lost in these pop culture kind of debates, but as I said, that are framed by the right, and that's really frustrating. And so that's why I chose it. And that's why I was just going back. I think that everyone, if they have a chance, should listen to our discussion that you and I had on Delete Your Account, because we talk about some of these issues in greater depth that we may not address here today.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think one of the particulars that I kind of expressed there, and I think I would pulled away from this as well, is that there's a sincere concern that essentially white leftists can get enough of what they want without the liberation of more marginalized communities, and then these cancel cultures is kind of a response, or what as it exists or whatever, is essentially oftentimes those marginalized communities saying, hey, that's happening right now. This is you're leaving us out. You're not recognizing how this liberation struggle is leaving us out, and it's a response to not liking that criticism. Really is kind of where I've seen a lot of the cancel culture complaints come out of, and whether there's some overzealous people that take on particular issues for the sake of a superficial kind of thing, I don't think that exists to any significant degree to which it warrants any of the type of the attention that it gets, as you mentioned, as far as a place on the left in the main part of the conversation discourse.
That's right. And I also, as I said in that interview as well, that like when people talk about the top down kind of cancel culture, so what you were describing, Richard, is what I call like the bottom up, quote unquote, cancel culture, right? At least if we're using their framing to call what I would consider legitimate grievances against people with power, if we're calling that cancel culture, then that's the bottom up version. And then they also sometimes talk about the top down version. But I would argue, so like, let's say someone getting fired because they support Palestinian rights or Black Lives Matter. To me, that's not cancel culture. And the reason I have a problem with that framing is because, like, for socialist reasons, because it takes away our real discussion of power and capitalism, right? And the way power operates under capitalism. So if you work for a company that's telling you can't wear a t-shirt that says Black Lives Matter, they're infringing upon your First Amendment rights. They're not canceling you, right? They're infringing upon your rights, and they're limiting your ability to express yourself within a capitalist system because they don't want to, quote unquote, alienate customers, right? And in reality, they're not going to alienate customers. They're the ones who are offended. The CEOs are the ones who are offended if your politics question or reason to question their actions as CEOs or as people with power. You know what I mean? Like, it's, if we talk about, if we try to frame what capitalism traditionally does and what power traditionally does as canceling, as something as frivolous as that, then that kind of cheapens the discussion about hierarchies and capitalism. As I said, I think it takes away from our socialist critique of systems instead of, you know what I mean? Because it just cheapens it. It turns it into this like internet spat, as opposed to an actual expression of power within the system we have.
I think that's an excellent point, and particularly the emphasis on the power dynamic at play and who's holding the power and in the systemic power at play is all critical elements when looking at any situation where either an individual or a group of individuals are expressing their opinion, and then what the ramifications and consequences are for the expression of that opinion, and then how the dynamics at play as well as how the political angle will affect that. Whereas if your politics are to the left, it's in likelihood that you're going to be in conflict with whatever capitalist ideals the management and bosses and owners are kind of supporting or believing. And so you're going to run into a lot more conflict than if you're expressing political views that are aligned with capitalism.
And I agree with all of that. And I think the other part that comes out in this discussion is the fact that, like, what we end up overlooking if we frame everything as a matter of quote unquote canceling. Because I think we have recently, there was, I think, I don't know if they were specifically Black Lives Matter or if they were affiliated with an offshoot thereof, but they had disrupted a brunch. And, apparently some left-wing media, including TYT, I believe, had sort of complained about that, about this group interrupting people while they were dining or whatever, and kind of accusing them of being basically canceling a segment of the society. And what they were doing in actuality was trying to raise awareness in an everyday space so that people weren't comfortable. You know what I mean? Like, this is what protest is about, right? Like, sort of raising the stakes and making people understand that their comfort means our suffering sometimes. Often it's a one-to-one relationship. And so I think that, in overlooking those kinds of moments, what people end up doing is sort of signaling that this issue is not important, or this, we don't like your way of protesting. We want, it goes into that paternalism you and I talk about a lot on the left, at least among some white leftists, at least the way things are articulated right now, right? Because it's not everyone. I always have to emphasize that, like, not all white leftists, like not all. But I think there's a layer of the online left and the leftists in general that still holds the keys to power in a lot of ways. Like they exercise power on our side. They may not have power within the system in quite the same way, but they still manage to exert power over the means and methods through which we try to articulate and form our leftist body of, you know what I mean? Like our leftist body politic. And so I think that there's a real problem there. And there was an interview done, I don't know if it was done by Chuck Modi, but Chuck Modi definitely tweeted this out, where there was an interview done with a young woman who was a Black Lives Matter protester at the March on Washington this weekend. And she basically said, like, we are part of the left, right? Like, we agree, we want Medicare for all, we want, free college, we want all of the same things that you do, and yet you ignore us or you denigrate us for the things that we're doing to also establish our right to exist as Black people in this country without fear, right? And so there's a real disconnect sometimes when you have and I've seen this as well, where people are kind of talking about Black Lives Matter as if it's like this corporate, it's already been co-opted by corporations and therefore it has no meaning anymore. And that ignores all the hundreds of thousands of people on the ground who are fighting for their rights. And this is including white people too. Like, it's Black and white and all sorts of races coming together to fight the police, like literally fighting the police. And they're being, insulted and denigrated and basically being told that they've been co-opted when they're still doing a lot of very real work, and it's got to be frustrating for them to be sort of insulted in real time by people that they expect to be their comrades,
Yeah, sometimes it makes me wonder what people think no justice, no peace means. It's like,
right.
No peace. It's like, if we're not getting justice, you're not getting peace. That's the bargain here. And it seems as though they're like, well, no, we want peace and we'll deliver justice. Just, wait a little bit on that. And a lot of the white left, I think, has also embraced the kind of idea that, well, we want to get you justice. We agree with your methods, or we agree with your goals, but we can't, sign on to your methods. And it's just, to me, it's just the frustrating part is just, I don't think anybody would, those people out there protesting have a lot of other things that they'd rather be doing, but they don't get to have that justice. And so they don't get to live in peace and without that fear. And so the only thing that they can do is present that in such a way that it disrupts other people's lives who otherwise would not have to live under that fear of and without that justice. And that is just, it's so basic, and to me it's hard to understand how intellectuals on the left are then able to dissemble into well, my racist uncle is going to be offended, so we can't say that.
Right. And the uncle is the operative word here. Like, it's family members that they're afraid to offend, or they're afraid to, they don't want to disengage these people. They still see them as loving and part of their lives in some way or whatever, but they're also afraid to confront them. And if you have, like, I don't know, like we say, sleeping with the enemy, right? If you're sleeping with the enemy, it's going to be very hard for you, not to say that you're sleeping with your uncle, but if you're, if you have a close relationship with someone who's representative or engaged in, white supremacy, it's going to be hard for you to distance yourself and hard for you to call that person out. I mean, this is the person who was part of your life, and you saw positively, typically speaking, right? So it's kind of difficult I guess it's difficult to recognize these people as the people we need to be fighting and not inviting into our circles in quite the same way that I think some people want to, because they're unaware of or don't care that these kinds of people pose a physical and real tangible threat to people of color and people of marginalized economic, racial, social groups when they're trying to organize with one another. So we have to really, I don't know, people need to get their priorities straight, and there's a lot of work to be done. But I raise all of this because these are the issues that these women were dealing with in their time as well. Going back to what you were saying about the frustrations of like seeing this stuff rehashed in the present and knowing that it's been 50 years later and we're still seeing the same problems, you know.
It's like some of it verbatim, but continue.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's exactly right. And, you know, you could pick this up and with the exception of a certain set of terminology. So like sometimes instead of gender, they say sex, and when they actually, like nowadays we would consider it probably gender, or like they have a few, like they say things like sexual identity to refer to masculinity and femininity, right? Or like woman and man. That's the language that we wouldn't use anymore. We wouldn't call like female or male or woman or man sexual identity, because usually sexual identity now refers to like LGBT or whatever, straight or gay or etc. And so other than that, you could pick this up and put it in the present and it would feel like, oh, did you write that a couple weeks ago? You know, like
You could publish
is this a Medium post? Yeah, like is this a Medium post you just hit send? You know what I mean? So it's very relevant and recent in terms of recent stuff going on too. So on that note, let's get into the reading. Again, like I said, it's very short. So for those of you who have a chance, definitely check it out. We have it posted on Patreon, but it's also like on our Twitter page and it will be in the show notes as well. And as always, just as a reminder, if you're reading it and you have questions or things that you want us to discuss further in other episodes, please leave us a comment on the Patreon page, which is open to the public. It's free, or via social media, and we'll try to respond to it in the next episodes, because sometimes these things have a part 2, but then also just in like any other episode we obviously have the time to discuss any questions or concerns or comments that people want to leave. But getting into the reading, it basically lays out, first of all, like who they are, why they've been meeting, which we can go into in a little bit, and then it discusses what their vision of this collective work, what it should look like in order to be more inclusive, and also sort of stick to the left-leaning goals that they have, because they're basically arguing that many groups have unfortunately strayed from completing those goals because of their biases and because of their inability to recognize the ways that oppression is lived through different people in different ways. And I think also, we could talk a little bit about intersectionality, but intersectionality had not been coined at this point, if I'm not mistaken, because I think Kimberly Crenshaw's work was in the 80s or 90s. And I'll include some of her stuff as well. But basically this argument that these women are making about kind of interlocking oppressions builds on a lot of the work that people like Claudia Jones had done. So Claudia Jones is a communist, Afro-Caribbean communist. She had lived and worked in the United States, lived and worked in the UK, and dealt with a lot of, just complete and utter state repression over and over and over again. But she's definitely someone that we should talk about in a separate discussion on like post-it note. Let's talk about Claudia Jones, because several of our guests have discussed her, of one of them being Sharice Burden-Selly. She mentions her all the time. We've had others who talk about her as well. But she's someone who's very important to this discussion of left feminism, and especially Black left feminism, right, and what that looks like. And one of the sort of foremothers, if you will, of what intersectionality means and how it actually is something that can be applied to leftist discourse and leftist ideology. And I think lately that's another problem I've seen, where people have been trying to say that intersectionality is somehow incongruent with leftism, which is doesn't make any sense. But anyway, these women talk quite a bit about the ways that they're dealing with issues of class, issues of race, issues of gender, issues of sexuality. They're dealing with oppressions on all of those fronts, and yet they can't find a space where all of those issues are properly addressed. And they come to the conclusion basically that they need to meet, first of all, just for their sanity, right? Because they're so frustrated in these other spaces that they've been trying to organize in, that they feel like they need to just meet to vent. But then their venting sessions end up becoming organizing sessions, and spaces where they can talk and think about these things and take back the ideas to their respective communities. But then also within it, they come up with different terms, not just terms in terms of terminology, but terms in terms of agreements and stakes and things that they're setting out for their movements that they want to be prioritized. And they basically come to the conclusion that, you know, they have to do things on their own sometimes to get them done right. But they also understand that for everyone to have liberation, the most oppressed people need to be liberated, right? So it cannot be a top-down process. It has to be a bottom-up process, and that sort of freedom of oppression has to radiate outwards. It can't just be like a, well, now that white women can vote, we're good. You know, there's, as people often say, there's no trickle-down equality, right? There's no trickle-down. There's no trickle-down equality, and so why don't we start with the first couple of pages, Richard? We can get into a little bit about, why they're meeting, what they saw as significant for them to discuss, and sort of how they frame Black feminism in the setup for this piece.
Yeah, I guess some of the things that immediately kind of stood out to me in that first section was, I guess, as you mentioned, the kind of description of their origin and the women's movement out of the late 60s and referencing it, and that a lot of the members had been active in it. But it was also kind of what I picked up in the read, or just kind of in how it was said, is that it was something that had happened. It didn't seem as active in that, the way it was phrased. I don't know. And I think you talk a little bit more about the context generally, but it feels as though that there was a feeling that the civil rights movement had somewhat had a sort of an ending, but that there was a new wave of movements of both feminism and liberation that this was being a part of, and that was built out of that. And then I guess one of the other things that I personally related to was, there's a quote in there that says, "It was our experience and our disillusionment within these liberation movements, as well as experience on the periphery of the white male left, that led to the need to develop a politics that was anti-racist, unlike those of white women, and anti-sexist, unlike those of Black and white men." And I personally, through the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, really, it's been a political movement, and trying to find a space. I've experienced and something similar. Now, I personally, cis male, I don't subscribe to gender binaries, but that's just kind of how I've grown up and how I've identified, and I haven't mined out to do the work there, so that's just kind of where I am there. But I can only imagine how much more marginalizing and just alienating that experience has to have been for Black women, and especially queer Black women. And so that was just something that kind of really stuck out to me, and I was just like, wow, it's not something I really had thought about. And it was also a moment for me to recognize how a lot of other people from less marginalized or not really considered marginalized communities experience the recognition of the suffering of other people that they've been screaming about for as long as they've had lungs, but hasn't really been heard. And so I can kind of understand. It gave me a moment of realization in both directions, I think.
Yeah, and I mean that line that you mentioned about the alienation and the sort of being in between these movements and not finding a space, definitely resonated with me as well. The difference, the issues with white male leftists, but then also the women's movement, both being alienating spaces for Black women who are on the left and Black feminists. It's one of the things that came up a lot actually in my discussion with Malika Jabali about the Kamala Harris pick as VP, which y'all should check out as well, previous episode to this one. But it's something that I think a lot of us have to deal with if we're part of marginalized groups in terms of ethnicity, race, gender, sexuality, whatever, and we're trying to operate within systems that are made up of, or at least dominated by, people who are in the social hierarchy, the fabric, a bit higher on the scale, right? And so it can be difficult because we're working through their biases as well. But I think this first part where they're talking about Black feminism, what's fascinating to me is that they rely on a lot of the way they frame Black feminism is they see it as directly connected to third world feminism, to workers. They don't say it, the way that they frame it is definitely completely against the bourgeois white feminist movement, which is great, because I said, like, I'm like really getting excited about this, but I like the way they talk about it, because I feel like nowadays what unfortunately happens a lot, I see this a lot in like online discourse and then some writing as well, is that there's often a separation that happens. So there's sort of, some people frame Black feminism as like indirect conflict with Black men, or indirect conflict with the left, as this sort of like bourgeois white feminism painted Black, or painted brown. And so I think this sort of looking at these women are sort of in between the second wave and the third wave of feminism, but they have like their own perspective, because I think Black women in particular, and they talk about this, have always had a slightly different understanding of feminism, because their feminism was not just about like being able to work, because they'd always worked, right? Like Black women in this country were slaves, and then they were laborers. They were always workers. They were often, having to help as breadwinners of their family, sometimes the sole breadwinners of their family, right? So this idea of feminism for them was not about like getting out of the home to work, which is what the, bourgeois white feminist was concerned about. And it wasn't so much one of respectability, because they weren't given the same they weren't given the same level of respect or honor, or all of these sorts of norms created by the sort of Victorian, British, and by extension American ideal woman. You know what I'm saying? Like they weren't seen as these like sensitive flowers that had to be protected, because they were lower class women, they were poor women, they were Black women, they were descendants of slaves, etc. So there was never this sort of protective shell around Black women. Even if you go back to slavery, right? Like they weren't given the same rights as white women, period. But then on top of that, like they were violated constantly, often with their men not being able to do anything to defend them, right? So it kind of dissolved all of this like protective shell that I think white women, I know, like we have historical and contemporary records to attend to this, but like that white women have often always have had, right? And so this idea of like the respectable white woman, who was able to work and have children and do all these things, but still be seen and respected as a mother, and respected as an equal, and respected as a woman, that was not quite the same experience what that Black women had in the society. So they were fighting for different things. And so I think the fact that these women bring up, for example, abolitionist Black women like Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, these kinds of foremothers in the Black feminist movement is really important, because it frames Black feminism as always being one engaged in a fight, right? Whereas I think some of the white feminists that they were dealing with, that these women were dealing with on a regular basis, of course, those women were engaged in a fight too, but it was often like a fight in many ways to define themselves against Black women or Black men, right? And these women kind of mentioned that too. They're like, white women generally did not see, they were like the white women that they were dealing with in terms of their feminism were of course against patriarchy, but at the same time, these women in the Combahee River Collective are arguing that those white women at the drop of a hat, however, would ally themselves with the white men who were oppressing them so that they could collectively oppress people of color, right? And so like, you know what I mean? Like patriarchy is terrible until you can be used to your benefit to like ward off the hordes of Black people, so there's kind of a double-edged sword there. And I think these women recognize that very clearly and discuss it in their definition of what Black feminism is. The other thing I just wanted to say in this section is that I think it's fascinating that they use terminology that like hints at intersectionality. So they say, for example, that their oppressions are interlocking. They use terms like caste to talk about race and class and gender, not a gender identity, but gender expression and sexual identity. And then they also have this, they position themselves as adversaries to the American system, which is also interesting. Like they see Black feminism at its root as an adversarial position. So it means a woman who's always fighting for her existence and her survival. They don't see it as just something that's like trying to get, it's not, they don't see their feminism as a group who's trying to just get recognized, right? They see it as a group that's actively fighting and sometimes physically fighting for the sake of survival. And so I think I thought that was really interesting to like define your movement on the basis of action, you know, and like adversarial action, reacting to and fighting against the elitism and racism and sexism that you're dealing with.
Yeah, I don't know if it's mentioned in the first part in particular, but identifying just the existence of Black women as a adversarial position to the patriarchal white cis male dominated society, that just in existence it's an act of defiance, and that the system responds and treats people, Black women, that way especially. And one of the things that I guess I see in this that also resonates with today's times for me in general is just that the adversarial position, and it is framed as Black women being aggressive when really all they're doing is defending themselves against a system that is malicious. And so like it's defensive actions are seen as aggression, whereas the status quo aggression is just seen as that is the status quo.
Right. Yeah. And it's there, you know, there's always that like, or not always, but lately people have been saying like, is there the angry Black woman stereotype? Like she's justified in being angry, right? It's unfortunate that it's become a stereotype, but like if you kind of scratch at it, if you look at the root of it, like why is she angry? You know, like don't Black women have a right to be angry? Like fuck, you know what I mean? Like
yeah, the expression that like every day that this country doesn't burn down is a testament to the patience and the willingness to compromise and all these things of the Black people in this country. Is like there's more than hundreds of years worth of abundant fucking reason to just really not put up with it anymore. And so it's that it's only reaches these boiling points ever so often, and it's even at these boiling points is rather controlled, is a testament to willingness to work through this in as peaceful a way as possible, and the simple and the relentless aggression from the state and from the system that wants to maintain that marginalization.
Right. And they talk about that. I mean, they mention like the stereotypes that come along with Black womanhood from the society, and how those stereotypes have operated to sort of separate Black women into a unique category that can be oppressed, and how they have come together in order to instead respond to their situation with love. Like they're saying that like their radical, or so I should say their embrace of themselves, to love themselves, is actually a radical act, considering that the society repeatedly does the opposite, right? So they say, if you put this in, I mean, we don't hardly have page numbers on our version, but it would be around page 4 if you stick it into Google Docs. But they say, quote, "We realize that the only people who care enough about us to work consistently for our liberation are us. Our politics evolve from a healthy love of ourselves, our sisters, and our community, which allows us to continue our struggle and work." So like, I really appreciate that, because you and I have talked a lot about this idea of like radical love and radical happiness on the left that sometimes feels like it's lacking, you know, because we're constantly involved in a fight and responding to things. But in some ways, like certain times, and this is something that you hear a lot nowadays, but I think it's been cheapened because of the discussion around like self-care and stuff, and self-care being more a matter of like what you can purchase and commodify, like what you can buy. Like, can you get a spa package and then you have self-care, as opposed to like, you know, radical love of self in response to a society that hates you and like constantly exercises hate towards you. So I appreciate their mention of that, love as a sort of shield of sorts, of protection, and also part of their fight, because it's often missing from our movement work, and it should be at the center of it. But on that note, going further in this second section, what they talk about is identity politics. This is where they start getting into that discussion. And so they say, quote, "This focusing upon our own oppression is embodied in the concept of identity politics. We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end someone else's oppression. And then in the case of Black women, this is a particularly repugnant, dangerous, threatening, and therefore revolutionary concept, because it is obvious from looking at all the political movements that have preceded us that anyone is more worthy of liberation than ourselves. We reject pedestals, queenhood, and Washington paces behind. To be recognized as human, levelly human, is enough. So I really love this section of the reading, because I think what's interesting is what they're saying is like, so just to make it clear, like throughout the text, they're not saying they're not going to fight for other people. What they're saying is that we've been fighting for other people. We're always fighting for other people. We never take the time to check in with ourselves and sort of see what's going on with ourselves and our own community. Like we're trying to do that, but whenever we bring those issues up, we're shut down, you know, or the person or the people that we're trying to bring it up to don't respond well. And they say, wait, like you often mention, Richard, you're like, well, just wait a second. Like, just, we'll get to you. Like you're next in line. And then that time never comes. And so what they're saying is like, what they have to do in order for them to be whole, right? In order for them to be better fighters, in order for them to be able to kind of address their needs. First of all, they have to address their needs. They have to name them. They have to kind of understand what's going on. They have to understand their oppression. That's why they've come together in the first place, right? To sort of hash out what's happening to them. But then on top of that, they have to also be able to be in a moment in this space, the space that they're forming, to reflect on and fight for their own rights. And in that way, that's what they mean by identity politics, right? They're not saying we're not going to help other people. We're not interested in other people. We're saying that we go through the world in a specific way. We experience oppression in a specific way as Black, you know, working class, socialists, women of color, you know, fill in the blank. This is what we're dealing with. And we have to address what's happening to us on the basis of what is happening to us that is unique to our experience. It's not going to be the same as white women. It's not going to be the same as white men. It's not going to be the same as Black men. And so I think, you know, what gets lost in the discussion of identity politics is people seem to think that it means that you're bringing up these issues or you're bringing up the ways that you're being oppressed just to bring it up and have like a bargaining chip or like a token of sorts. And what they're saying is, no, that's not what it's about. We're saying that we go through the world and experience oppression in a specific way, and that needs to be addressed. And that if we don't address that, no one else will. So we have to take a moment to do it for ourselves. And if they're not going to stand up for us, if we're not going to stand up for ourselves, who's going to stand up for us, you know? So I feel like that's what they're kind of saying. And they're also saying like, we don't want to be, we're not like special or anything in the sense that we don't want someone to turn our oppression into some kind of, battle cry for themselves. We don't want to be tokenized. We don't want to be turned into, they say, like, we don't want to be turned into queens or put on a pedestal, but we also don't want to be left behind. We don't want to be marginalized within these movements. We just want to be equal, you know? And I think that's really important.
Yeah, and there's always this kind of undercurrent of a feeling from the oppressor group that this call for equality is a call for supremacy, and that it's to turn the current overclass into an underclass rather than as for to be treated equally. And I think that's important. One of the other things that kind of reminded me of that is the quote says, "We realize that the liberation of all oppressed peoples necessitates the destruction of the political economic systems of capitalism, imperialism, as well as patriarchy." And it feels as though that's like written to the white left today. That's just like, oh, you're bringing up these issues, and it's like, it's because you don't understand that class supersedes all things. And it's like, it links it. And it's like, no, we get all of that. We have to destroy capitalism. We get imperialism. We get what you're not understanding is that we have these other issues, and it's like, and that they need consideration too. And if we don't, as you mentioned, if we don't raise them, then nobody will, and that's like a critical thing. So it's like, I think it feels it feels like it should be unnecessary, but that they put in there specifically. We understand what socialism is. We get it.
Right.
It's like we're not using it as a cover to make black women's supremacy. That's not
Right.
the grand plan here, which is
Right.
somehow what manifests in some of people's minds. And I think one of the other that came out of there was that white feminists had no need to have racial solidarity with men of their same race, unless it was to oppress other minorities or to other oppressed groups. Whereas black women had saw a necessity in having solidarity with black men, and then they just kind of discuss that tension a bit. And I thought it was there was a particular line that stood out that in that part that I wanted to capture. Let me just find it here. Is that we have a great deal of criticism and loathing for what men have been socialized to be in this society, what they support, how they act, and how they oppress. And it was like, that's a very, very polite way of putting it.
And they also talk about the system. But it's cool that they talk about the system too. They're not saying that like men are inherently like this. They're saying the system has been created to make men like this. They almost give men a little out, like an excuse of sorts.
And they turn it into systemic.
Right, but it's cool that they turn it into, it's almost like they can hear their opponents as they're writing this, because you even again today you're like, instead of focusing on individuals, let's focus on the system. And they're like, yeah, we're focusing on the system, and we're saying that the system creates shitty individuals. So like, let's combat the system, let's do that, but you'll also have to check yourselves, it's just really smart. It's
Yeah, it was they also just talk about how you mentioned kind of some of the differences between how black feminists and white feminists were, not just how they behaved, but how they were perceived by other people. And I think one of the things that they capture there is that these women had been identified as smart, and that had affected their perceived beauty. And I don't know if you had some thoughts or comments on that. I was kind of a bit curious about it, I guess.
Yeah, I remember that section because they talk about smart ugly, right? They say like their intelligence automatically makes them ugly. And I think also what's fascinating is that like, because these are queer women, some of them are more butch as well. But I think that also sort of plays into the discussion, right? Like the way their femininity is framed by the larger society, they're rejected from that. Like they're not seen as women in many ways. You know what I'm saying? And even though they're clearly women, and they're articulating their demands through feminism, through feminist lens, but they're rejected. The society doesn't see them as women in the typical sense, or women at all. It's kind of hard to explain, and I found in my like academic spaces, like explaining this, sometimes people don't understand, but like black women are not seen as women by the society generally. And by that, I mean, we are not treated in the same way that white women are treated. We're not given the same benefit of the doubt in terms of being believed when it comes to sexual assault and of a grand variety of things. We're not listened to in the same way when it comes to just sort of like, I mean, on any level, but also just in general in terms of expressing our femininity, like we're not taken seriously. And I think that there's a degree to which we have to go above and beyond to define ourselves as feminine, to the point that it's almost caricature of what womanhood means in order to be seen as woman. And even then we're just sort of seen as like object, right? So if you think about like the recent controversy over the WAP video with Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion, it's sort of like black women aren't seen as women unless they're like hyper feminine, hyper this, hyper that. But then again, it goes into objectification, right? Like, are you like whose idea of femininity and womanhood are you like displaying, right? Is it what men want? Is it what you want? Is this what actually women are? You know what I'm saying? So it kind of it becomes. And there's also the element of like always there's a stereotype or trope of sorts that like black women are seen as super strong, like we're always strong, right? And the problem with that is that we're not given the ability to be seen as weak. We're not being given the ability to be seen as like, when I say weak, I mean like human emotion kind of weak, like the average person has their moments of weakness. And if we're always strong, if the construction is that Black women are always strong, then that means we don't feel pain. That means we don't need help. That means we don't need attention or focus on us. We don't need support. And so that then dissolves. It turns into things like mistreatment in the healthcare industry, mistreatment by other men, even Black men, mistreatment by other Black women, you know, like not recognizing each other as human. And so there's a long history of sort of like the dehumanization and the defeminization of the Black woman. And I think that's what they're kind of addressing. But in particular, in general, women who are intelligent are disregarded and not really seen as equals to intelligent men, but they're also, you know, like insulted, basically. Like if you're a smart woman, people want to take you down a notch, you know, and the way they take you down a notch is instead of talking about arguments related to intellectual pursuits, it's like, well, you're ugly. You're some like ugly woman. Cause you know what I mean? Like if you think about like nerds or whatever, right? Like they're not seen as cute or pretty because they're too smart. They become competition for men instead of sexual objects for men. And I think that's what they were kind of getting at there.
And I think that's interesting the way when you talk about it like that, I can see how internalizing a lot of those kind of perceptions, even the presumably, you know, positive ones like being strong or whatever, can result in having negative effects on the other side in ways that weren't necessarily, I guess, foreseen, I guess. And so like it's enlightening to me that it could be, I guess, the internalization of a lot of those negative kind of stereotypes, or even the presumably positive ones like being strong, can result in, or then I can connect that to how loving themselves is such a revolutionary act, and like see how that connects to the larger picture that has been being drawn throughout the piece.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that, because it's like if you're strong, you don't need love, right? You don't need support. You got it. You know, like you're good. And I think that they're saying like no one. I mean, on the one hand, as you said, you know, it's a positive stereotype, but it kind of operates like the Asian model minority myth, right? And I think there's a lot of model minoritization for women, Black women in particular, or women of color, but especially Black women, because the idea is like, okay, we make more money sometimes than Black men, depending on the group of women. It's kind of, it's hit or miss. And there's a lot of statistics floating around about this that people are still trying to understand. But Black women at least tend to have higher degrees, at least than Black men. They tend to go to college, university, grad school, et cetera, at higher frequencies. There are a variety of reasons of why that is. But we're kind of put in a position where like, we're strong and we're super educated and we support our families and we do all these things, but we're not women, or we're not soft. We're not feminine. We're not, fragile. We don't need care. We support everyone. And then you often hear the language of like, we're the mule, right? Because pack mules are really strong. They can carry tons and tons and tons and tons of weight and loads, right? But that doesn't mean that they're happy doing that. You know what I mean? Like it turns it into a job instead of something that we're doing by circumstance, right? Like the reason that Black women are taking on all these things and why that is often a response to our society not valuing us, you know, or a response to like our families not valuing us, a response to sometimes absentee fathers or absentee husbands, or a society that doesn't support our husbands in order to support us. You know what I'm saying? So it's like a whole host of issues that's putting us in that position. And I think on the one hand, we as Black women have responded by saying, we're strong, you know, we can take on anything and we're powerful and we can do this. So on the one hand, it's a positive thing, and we're trying to kind of embrace the reality that we have to face every day. But it has a dark underbelly, which is there are circumstances that cause the situation, that put us in these situations where we don't have a moment to relax and we don't have the time or the energy to care for ourselves. We're always caring for other people, and we always have, right? Like even if you think about like during the slave time, like we were wet nurses for white babies. You know, we were the ones who were breastfeeding those women's babies. We were caring for their children. Go through Jim Crow. You look at it. We can't sit at the same dinner table or lunch table with you, but we're taking care of your children and we're cleaning your house. Like it's always this sort of like this sort of juxtaposition that doesn't make any sense. You know, it's incongruent, where we're doing everything, but we're not given any appreciation. We're not given any support. We're not understood. We're not listened to. And so I don't know, I think the parts that you just drew out, Richard, and what you were just talking about, like really capture what happens to us as Black women. But I think, you know, like really resonated with me just as a Black woman reading this. And I think probably resonates with a lot of women of color who are dealing with sort of social issues on the one hand, and then trying to navigate that as a woman on the other hand. It's a double-edged sword. I wanted to address something in a similar section, or like around that section, that I thought was really good as well, where they talk about going back, actually, what you said when they were talking about like the class oppression part. I think that also was not just in order to say like to sort of cover it, right? Because I think you were saying like they're kind of anticipating the arguments of their detractors, right? Or like, you guys don't talk about class enough or whatever, like class. It's like, yes, okay, we get it. But I think it also is, in some ways, however subtle, a kind of reminder that like we're not stupid. You know what I'm saying? We read Marx too. We read Engels too. We're fucking smart. We know the process. We also are coming even from oftentimes working class backgrounds. So you don't need to tell us. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think that also, that was like a little, I mean, it's said, as you said, very politely, right? But I think it was kind of one of those moments where they're saying like, look, we get it, but not only do we get it, but we live it, or we're experts in it, or we've read the same books as you, and we're coming away with the same conclusions, but you're missing a part. Like, y'all are the ones who are wrong, not us. And I think that was
like, you guys just stopped halfway. Like, you got part of the way there, and then you guys just stopped when once you were covered, you were done. And it's like, well, there's more here, and it's like, well, worker includes everybody. It's like, well, it's a little bit more complicated than that.
That's right. And they say that too. Like, they have right after they say that. Let me see if I can find the line again. Yeah, here we go. So it says here that we realize that the liberation of all oppressed peoples necessitates the destruction of political. Okay, that's the part you read. Let me see. There's another part where they have yeah, here we go. So like they say things like, for example, we are not convinced, however, that a socialist revolution that is not also a feminist and anti-racist revolution will guarantee our liberation. So they're like, you made you all right, but then what about us, right? Like, you're also, what are you going to do for the people that you're leaving behind in this process? And then they say, we have arrived at the necessity for developing an understanding of class relationships that takes into account the specific class position of Black women who are generally marginal in the labor force, while at this particular time, some of us are temporarily viewed as doubly desirable tokens at white collar and professional levels. And this is like what I was getting at before, right? So on the one hand, we're like hyper-represented in higher ed. We're hyper-represented as like CEOs and whatever. I mean, there aren't that many of us, to be honest, but there's like just enough to be like, look, you see, we have a Black CEO. Like, I think there was a woman who was like over Walmart at one point, or like part of Walmart, they hired a Black woman. Or even if you look at like the appointment of Kamala Harris, or if you look at the appointment of people like Condoleezza Rice, right? It's always like they can point to that one person and say, look, you see, we're looking after you guys. We're caring about you. We noticed you. We picked up one of you. So shut up. You know, like we have one of you in the higher position, so be quiet. But then the problem is what that does is it distracts from the grand majority. And this is why I say it's very much like the Asian model minority myth. It takes a small percentage that's doing well, and it uses it as a cudgel against the rest of the community to say, why aren't you doing well? So like Asian communities that are poor, that are not doing well economically, that just an individual that may not be doing well academically, right? It turns into, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you like the rest of your people? And so the way that Black women who are put up in these higher positions are used is as if to say, what's wrong with the rest of you people? Why don't you get in line? Why don't you do like Kamala? Why don't you do like Condoleezza? Why don't you do like Oprah? You know what I'm saying? And it becomes this exception, which is something that Michelle Alexander talks about a lot, the way this like Black exceptionalism ends up working against us. And so it's interesting that they touch on this, because it's like something I think very much fits into what we're talking about in the present, with tokenized Black people who end up distracting from the larger class interests of Black people, and especially Black women. And she also, or not she, but they go into a little bit later as well, they start talking about Marx, which is also, again, kind of a reminder, I think, to the readership, like, yeah, we've read the same things that you guys have, and we came to conclusions that are more comprehensive than you did. They say that we need to articulate the real class situation of persons who are not merely raceless, sexless workers. So again, the worker, so kind of deviating from the quote a little bit, the worker is not just this like generic white guy, is what they're saying, right? The worker is also someone who has to deal with gender oppression, who has to deal with racial oppression, etc. So anyway, quote, but for whom racial and sexual oppression are significant determinants in their working and economic lives. So literally the sexism and racism that they face also impacts how they're doing economically. Like it's such a given, right? Like, no shit. Right. But people still don't get this. Like it makes me crazy. So then they say, although we are in essential agreement with Marx's theory as it is applied to the very specific economic relationships he analyzed, we know that his analysis must be extended further in order for us to understand our specific economic situation as Black women, end quote. And I would argue, further as queer women, as queer people of color, etc. So I don't know. I love this. And it's a shame to me that like people literally don't read this. And then they're just like, identity politics are breaking up the left. And it's like, no, they're really like plugged into leftist theory, guys. They want the left to be better. Like, this is so easy. Like, what is wrong with people?
Yeah, and I mean, it's a relatively short document, and it's packed with good information. To me, it's an essential read, and it's one that I think should be near the top of people's lists if they haven't really started reading very much yet, or if they're trying to get somebody into reading more. This is like, it seems very fitting just because it packs a lot of these ideas into a rather short kind of presentation, and especially for women, I think it provides, it eases some of the kind of what they refer to as or craziness or whatever that's gets built up as a result of more or less getting gaslit by society as what you're experiencing. It's just how it has to be, kind of thing.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. I was thinking that too when I was reading it, because they have a section where they're like, listen, ladies, you're not crazy, okay? Like what you're experiencing is like social malaise, and it's like anti-Blackness, it's anti-womanhood, it's anti-this, it's anti-that. It's real, it's tangible, and here are the effects. And these are the effects that we're trying to combat. I thought it was great.
I was just going to quickly mention this, like, I thought it was interesting that part of this whole process for them has been like digging into these things, because in their experience, no one had really examined the multi-layered texture of Black women's lives specifically in the way that centered them rather than kind of on the periphery. Like, I know I've read some older, like just not historical, but just older text and like just general kind of novel type stuff about like colorism and stuff like that. And the women, even when they're even the central figure in the story, the kind of unique experiences that they have as Black women and the multi-layered texture, as they put it in this piece, isn't really explored nearly as much as it often is with the men in the stories.
Right. There's also the way that just to break it down for people to kind of get, I want to like be more specific about what you're talking about. So in the text itself, they break down what this looks like in their experiences. So they say, for example, we would go to white women's groups and the white women didn't understand racism. And then we would go to Black groups and the Black men didn't understand sexism. Or we would go to women's groups, Black women's groups, and the Black women would be heterosexist. And then, or we'd go to Black women's groups and the Black women would be classist, right? They'd be women of a slightly higher economic background and they didn't understand working class concerns. And so it was always this like, it was like a trying to fit a circular peg into a square hole, you know, it was like never quite right. And that's how they ended up like coming together in the first place. But it's interesting to me also that they really talk a lot about class incongruency, like within the organizations that they were trying to join, at least the women's groups and the Black women's groups, which I thought was fascinating because that's another thing that's like often ignored in our contemporary discourse nowadays, where they act like for whatever reason, anyone who's bringing up identity concerns is also rich. Have you noticed that? Like, they kind of act like having concerns about race or gender or sexual orientation, or like, especially I see this a lot as it relates to trans issues. They act like all trans people are like Caitlyn Jenner, like these rich white women. And I'm just like, have you not recognized that like first of all, Black trans women are being killed at like disproportionate levels, including by other Black people, right? They're not just being killed by police, although they are being killed by police as well, but they're being killed by other Black people, specifically often Black men. So what do we do with that, right? And they're often poor. They're often like economically marginalized as well. They're literally like perfect target audience for issues around health, issues around economic equality, issues around housing and job protections, like so many issues. And they're just like completely disregarding, they're just missing an entire segment of the population. And just for some reason, and I've heard like Zizek and other people kind of make these arguments where like trans identity is somehow a bourgeois concern. And I'm just like, what in the hell are you smoking? How can you look at this population and tell me that they're like not marginalized economically too, and on all these other levels? Like, and I think it's an intentional exclusion, right? Like it feels intentional to me that they are framing these people. I think also often framing Black women, framing queer people as well in general as an upper class group. And I don't know why that is. And I don't, other than like to not have to deal with them, you know, it's very strange.
Oh yeah, it is definitely bizarre. And when you think of it from an internationalist perspective, it continues to not match up because transgender communities are often in marginalized groups throughout the world. And like, even where they're not necessarily as, in as much danger per se as many people in the transgender community are in the United States, they're still economically marginalized.
Right. And it's weird. I don't understand this. Like, I don't know. I'm trying to wrap my head around it, but I think there's an intention. I think it's intentional. At first I was like kind of giving people the benefit of the doubt because I was just like, maybe they're just out of touch and they don't understand, or like they're letting like white, again, sort of like what we mentioned earlier when we were talking about the overrepresentation at the top in order to tokenize and then mess up the people at the bottom, you know, like to hold them at a different standard or whatever. I think that on the one hand was kind of happening with the queer community because people who weren't queer were kind of looking at them and looking at like celebrities and stuff and saying, these are the representatives. And also these people keep bringing up these pesky identity issues. And so they must be bourgeois in some way. But they were ignoring all of the socioeconomic concerns that people were raising. And I think at this point it's on purpose. Like, I don't give them the benefit of the doubt anymore of being out of touch because we have too many examples at this point of people being murdered because let's say they were involved in sex work because they couldn't get a traditional job because of job discrimination on the basis of their gender identity. And then they couldn't keep their housing because of discrimination on the basis of their gender identity. And therefore they were put in a precarious labor situation. And then in that precarious labor situation, often sex work, they're then exposed to dangerous work conditions and work conditions that they're not given healthcare. They're not given any sort of legal protections if something happens to them, if they're abused in any way. And on top of that, they're marginalized in the society and people know that. And so their Johns, the people who patronize them, are then engaging in dangerous and often life-threatening practices, including violence, sexual violence, rape, and murder. And then the people who do this know that these women can't go to anyone, right? they know that they don't have any sort of societal backup. Like they don't have anyone who's going to be looking out for them and defending them. They know that the police aren't going to defend them. So who are they going to call for help? And so it's sort of like, it reminds me of the Holtzclaw guy. Do you remember this police officer who was like raping Black women specifically? You remember that?
Well, I mean, I'm remembering a case. It may not be the same one. But.
Okay, there was a guy who like raped multiple Black women. He was a police officer, Asian American police officer. And he basically said, like, I did it to them because I knew no one would back them up. I knew no one would believe them. And I knew no one would help them. And I think that the same sort of mindset operates when you see trans women being killed, especially Black trans women, at disproportionate rates to the rest of the community because of that same mentality, right? Like they don't have anyone who's going to back them up and help them in the state and in society in general. Like they're rejected on all sides. And so I think some of the stuff that these women are talking about kind of gets at contemporary issues that we're dealing with other groups as well. And when I say other groups, I don't mean like these are not Black women, but I mean in the sense that like they're a specific group beyond what these women were talking about necessarily. Because they're in this particular reading, they're talking primarily about cisgender Black women. But I don't know. I think that there's a degree to which people on the left sometimes use the pop cultural visibility of a group and they mistake that for equality, and it's not the same thing.
Yes, the kind of superficial representation that can be readily identified as, not endemic of policies that match, that we can readily see in something like the Republican Party and the Black people that they parade on stage during the RNC, but is a little bit harder to identify in the slightly more nuanced situations for some people, it seems. And one of the things I just wanted to add on there about when you're talking about the transgender issues and violence and not having anyone to go to, one of like a common misconception about crime and deterrence is that, punishment is a deterrent, and the statistics and the research doesn't really bear that out. What actually is the strongest deterrent for crime or aberrant behavior is the believing that you're going to be caught. And so the confidence that the people don't have anybody in society to essentially catch you just emboldens people to be even more malicious.
Yeah, like they have no, I mean, there's no accountability in that case, right? They're not afraid. And there's also, I mean, this issue of like shame comes up for me as well. Like if the society would shame that person for doing what they did, then maybe they wouldn't do it. But there's not even a shame element, right? It's just like some people are just considered disposable and others are not.
Well, it is an unfortunate situation that we've arrived in. And I feel sometimes that there's a sentiment generally that everything is already so messed up before we got here that then it feels overwhelming to be burdened with the responsibility of kind of unpacking and dealing with that stuff. But it's our responsibility. And the more that we're unpacking is the less that's going to be there for the next generation to have to deal with. And that's what a lot of these people have been thinking. And one of the things that stretches throughout the history of Black women, activists, radicals, whatever, is that it was constantly about essentially planting trees that they wouldn't see the shade of. And so like as we benefit from so much of those, I see a responsibility to carry that on. And so I think it becomes increasingly necessary to take up causes of groups that I don't personally identify with in ways that I don't see the obligation for Black women, especially queer Black women or trans Black women or other marginalized women of color, especially Indigenous women.
Oh, I'm sorry. And I think that they have, like, they speak to that as well. In the text, they kind of start talking towards the end about how to address certain things, issues within other groups. And what I thought was interesting is that when they're talking specifically about groups that can exercise power over them, they basically say, like, it's not our problem to fix their shit. We're doing the best that we can. You can only do so much. And at the end of the day, they also eventually have to take on the responsibility of fixing stuff that's going on in their own community. So like they say, when they're talking about racism within the white women's movement, they say that as Black feminists, we are made constantly and painfully aware of how little effort white women have made to understand and combat their racism, which requires, among other things, that they have a more than superficial comprehension of race, color, and Black history and culture. Eliminating racism in the white women's movement is by definition work for white women to do, but we will continue to speak and demand accountability on this issue. And I think that kind of gets at what you were talking about just now, Richard, like how we can move forward. I think that we are seeing some of that happen in bits and pieces, right? So like I personally speaking I find it a positive thing that we see more white people getting involved in Black Lives Matter. We have to kind of see how that will play out over time. But I certainly think that if they're putting their bodies on the line and they're starting to have these discussions and conversations with their loved ones, their family members, significant others, friends, if there is something in the air, the rhetoric at least is circulating, that's a good thing. There are still people who need to do a lot of work, and I'm not saying that white liberals or white progressives or anything are perfect, not by any means, and y'all know that I'm critical often of white progressives who mess up, because I think that at this point they've had too much time to be making some of the mistakes that they do. They're not mistakes at this point. It's like not an unforced error if you keep making the same mistake. It's a pattern. But at the same time, I think that there is room for growth. But I think that they are the best messengers to themselves in many cases, right? And this goes for us too. I mean, like when it comes to messaging, sometimes I'm going to receive a message better if it's in my language. You know what I mean? And by language, I just mean like cultural language, right? And that's not to essentialize to say that I'm somehow so different that I have to have things done in a certain way for me to get hip to it or care about it. But there are certain appeals that people can make that are community specific. And I think that we know our communities best, right? We know what works best for our communities. And this is why, like during political campaigns and things like that, you always want to have people who are in touch with the community that you want to target, because that's where you're going to see the greatest successes. If you're dealing with people who may be from the community, but who don't have any friends in the community, who haven't been in the community, who've like been somewhere else, you know, with highfalutin, upper class, whatever, Harvard and Yale and all of this, and then you want to go to the ghetto and attract people to your cause, good luck. You know, there has to be a connection with a group of people. And I think that that's what they're kind of getting at. They're like, look, we can scream to the rooftops what we need done, but if y'all don't go talk to your people, it's not going to happen, because they're not going to listen to us. We've been socialized to not take seriously the concerns of marginalized groups, period. You know, that's just how it goes. And that's within marginalized groups, you know, like we ignore ourselves. And so we have to kind of figure out, or they're trying to figure out, you know, like what's the best way of getting people on board. And they're saying you have to be the go-between between us and your people for them to get it. They'll take it better if they hear it from you.
And I think there's also an aspect of, you know, like getting rid of the racism within the white feminist movement is white women's work or work for white feminists. And is like, there's an aspect of, well, like as a Black man or, you know, for Black women, whatever, is like want to work on the issues that we have within our community that we'd like to improve on and deal with, you know. So as Black man is like, I'd like to work on sexism with other Black men. I don't need to be worrying about getting rid of the racism among the progressive white left movement. Like that's not something I should be able to focus on improving like those aspects of it. And because there's always going to be these kinds of room for improvement. And if people aren't taking on responsibility within their own kind of identities, then it put burdening other more marginalized communities to express those things and help them work through it. It leaves them with even less time to work on the issues that are specific to them.
That's a really good point. And I think it's something that like I need to be better about, because I feel like I spend a lot of time online, like reacting to what I consider the reactionary elements within the left, which are often more often than not, propagated by a white leftist, unfortunately. But again, I think that has to do with biases that they have, connections with their family members, et cetera, that they're not willing to break, and just socialization, right? So again, this is not about, I'm going to take a page out of the book of the Combahee River Collective women and say, it's not about the individual, right? It's about the system that makes shitty individuals. They don't say it like that, but that's what I'm summarizing. But then when they talk about men and they're like, it's not inherent to maleness to be bad, but
Not biological determinism. Go ahead.
That's right. But because they have to say that, which is sad, because I think the issue is like, especially what they're reacting to, but it's something that we have to deal with now too, where like people think that feminists or Black people or whatever, like, hate white men just because they're inherently bad. And it's like, no, we're not saying that. We're saying that like the system.
And I feel bad that they're like falling over themselves to like make it clear, like, no, we are really concerned about Black men and their concerns, and we're with them in solidarity. Like they say it like several times. It's just like, oh, it shouldn't be necessary. Like,
right?
But
they
I'm
have
sure
so many.
If somebody who's going to read this and still read it as a man-hating document.
I mean, think about right now, again, like going back to what we were talking about in the very beginning. Think about how one of the major tenets from this book, or from this statement, the issue of identity politics, they have like one line about it, and how people have turned that into like this specter to be demonized on the left of all places, which is like freaking insane to me. Like, how can you take something as simple as just saying, look, we have different issues that we deal with and we want to address those? How can you say, like, how can you take something that simple and turn it into this like god awful, like, oh my God, like these women are like destroying the left by like saying that their lives are a little bit different because they have to deal with sexism and racism on top of classism. Like, it's strange. Like, how can you get, and again, I think that comes though from a place of the reactionary side of the left. It's coming from a place of racist and sexist bias, that they don't want to hear this, that they think that we're doing some sort of like, we're all secretly trying to take down the left by arguing that, hey, racism and sexism further impact our class inequality. Like, it just, I don't know, it's so silly. Like, it just seems so ridiculous to think that people are getting all up in arms about that like very basic statement.
It's like, I guess I kind of get if it's if for people that haven't really engaged in any of the theory and are just kind of coming at these things from their feelings and emotional situations and like their personal lives, and like that's how they've arrived here. But it's another thing when it's somebody who's very like intellectual and very, has read a lot of theory and is very engaged in the kind of Marxist thought, to then just like, I couldn't see Marx struggling with this. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like it would be very intuitive to him.
Right.
Like, it just wasn't in his kind of scene, to the limited degree that there was. And then it's like, and we saw that the people, Marxists that followed Marx, took up this issue, even like internationally, or like Mao and otherwise. Like, there was a recognition of the kind of commonality in the struggle there. And it's just bizarre to me that it's so it's so hard for the particularly Western left, and especially white Western left, to just kind of wrap their mind around.
And that's what I see. It feels intentional. I mean, it just, I don't understand. Like, okay, if you have 3 people, right? And one person has a tray, and the tray is like 50 pounds and it's kind of heavy, and they're like, yeah, this tray is heavy. And then you have a person with a tray and you add 20 pounds to the tray. The tray is heavier. They're like, hey, my tray is heavier than yours. Do you want to help me out a little bit? And then you have another person who has a tray, they add 50 pounds to, and their tray is the most heavy because they added weight to it, right? Not that they gave them a different tray necessarily, but they just added a different level of weight to the tray. And that person is going to say, look, y'all, like, I feel for you that your tray is 50 pounds. That sucks. But my tray is 100 pounds. So I'm going to need additional help carrying my tray. Like, this is I'm saying it in these like really kindergarten style, like breakdowns, because to me, it just seems so I don't know. It seems so basic to me. And maybe because I've experienced it, right? Like maybe because I am a Black woman, I understand, and I'm a Black woman who's had a working class background, who continues to have a working class background, who is not rich by any means, not even close. God, I wish, but woo, not anywhere close. And who has dealt with sexism, who's dealt with racism, who's dealt with classism and class inequality on a grand scale, who's literally applying for jobs right now and thinking to myself, you know, what am I going to do with myself in the next 10 years if I don't get a decent job? Am I going to be reliant upon my husband for income, and then his income is also in and out? Like, these are things that I'm thinking about in real time. And I think that's why, for me, reading this, really, it resonated with me. And I also don't understand why people can take a document like this that's so basic and clear, and they literally come up with, like, they address all the detractors throughout it. I mean, it's almost weighed down by their degree of trying to, like, get people to get them. That how can you take a document like this and, like, turn it into, like, I don't know, to demonize it. And I guess the only explanation I have, and that I keep going back to, is that I think it's just about the infiltration of right-wing ideology on the left, because this is the biases that, like, the biases that these women are fighting against. You know, they're saying it's reactionary to be racist on the left. It's reactionary to be sexist on the left. And in order for us to have a better left, we have to get rid of these problems, right? Like, you cannot fight for all workers if you think some workers are inherently unequal to you because they were born in one gender or one sex or one race, right?
Right? This just feels like the only logical extension you can arrive at.
I mean, it's funny because people are going to be like, why are they laughing? It's not funny. It's funny because we've had to say this how many times now? Like, how it's for us, it feels like, and I don't just mean me and you, Richard, Wendi. I mean, like, in general, people of color on the left and women on the left, women of color on the left, having to say this out loud. And, like, it just seems so easy to understand for us because we live it. And that people still don't get this it's so absurd that it makes us laugh. You know, like, you can't help but laugh because it's so basic.
Yeah, it's just so absurd. Just like, I mean, you're really, the thing that gets me too is that it becomes with such assertive and aggressive ignorance,
right?
Like, and confident ignorance and proud ignorance. And it's just like, I don't need to know that because it's identity politics and that's bourgeois. Like, what? Like, you don't get to just arrive at these beliefs without investigating them. That's not how Marxism works.
And, you know, to play devil's advocate, right? I think, and I mentioned this in the delete your account interview. You know, I think there are some people who go far, like very far. I think sometimes their concerns feel trivial to the average onlooker, right? And if you are, you know, like, drilling down so far on a specific issue that doesn't seem all that relevant, especially considering everything that's going on, it can feel like, why are you focusing on that? Like, who cares if this is the way that if this is what someone said, or who cares about our understanding of, I use the example of, like, some people had been debating the concept of time and whether it was Eurocentric, which it is, but, like, okay, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not going to write a treatise about it, but I like, in my own research, I understand, like, time is understood differently by different cultures, and the way we think of history and all of this and progress is different based on your personal experiences and your culture, blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. But I'm not going to spend exorbitant amounts of time debating it. I understand why people might want to, and that's okay. And I'm not going to spend my time demonizing those people because I have better things to do with my time. So I think sometimes, though, that when I see people doing what I consider, like, going overboard, like they're being so politically correct, or they're doing so much about identity that they kind of lose the forest for the trees, I don't demonize those people because I think they're onto something insofar as they are at least having deep thoughts about the reality in which we live. And they're questioning the norms that we've established on the basis of things like Eurocentricity, racism, sexism, classism. There's nothing wrong with that. That's a good thing. I don't think, though, that I personally, I think that the people who are, like, attacking those people, there's something wrong with them because they're trying to, like, go after these people who, like, aren't really addressing them. Like, if you're having a debate over the Eurocentricity of time, it doesn't necessarily have to concern you, like on the other end. You know what I mean? Like, you don't have to spend 30 minutes degrading people who are talking about stuff like that and saying that they're distracting from class politics, because you're the one who's distracting from class politics because you're focusing on that person instead of working on class politics. You get what I'm saying? Like,
yeah, no, exactly.
You're the problem, not them. Like, they're not the problem. You're the problem. Like, focus on, do your work. You know what I mean? Like, don't worry about what people are doing on the other side. They're not taking away from the work that we need to do. You're taking away from the work we need to do because all you're focusing on is these nitpicky, stupid things that have nothing to do with you, that if they don't concern you, you could just scroll past. And instead, you're harping on that because you don't want to put in the work that's required for us to get where we need to be in terms of class equality. You're the problem, not them.
Exactly. I mean, that's to me, a lot of it is there's a lot of work in it. In understanding and mining out the kind of ideas that are just planted in our head long before we start to even really think about what we think about. And it's so deep in there that it takes a lot of effort and work, and sometimes it's not fun, and sometimes you discover like, oh wow, I now understand this thing I did in my past is worse than I thought it was, or oh, I didn't know I was hurting people in this way, I didn't know I was offending this person that I value dearly, or whatever. It's like when you start investigating those things, you start to discover things that aren't always positive about yourself, and it's not a fun process, and it's easy to want to avoid that. And that's what I see a lot of in this is, it's like, or if it's not them individually, personally, it's somebody that they're close to, or somebody that they know, or somebody that they value, or sometimes it's somebody that has economic power over them. And so that like they want to include them in their political movement, and they can, so long as they don't talk about this, they don't talk about race, or they don't talk about gender, or they don't talk about queer people, or whatever it is that they're willing to sign on to all the other class aspects of the argument, but they're not willing to sign on to that. And in order to continue to appeal to them, they're willing to sacrifice and set aside the concerns of these more marginalized, or these other marginalized groups. And that just doesn't match up with the underpinning philosophy. So you gotta investigate that about yourself, if that's some place that you find yourself. And it's like,
right.
That's what I do, is like, if I find myself disagreeing with some marginalized group or person and expressing some idea, I investigate, well, why do I feel this way? Is this something that I've arrived at myself? Is this something that is it a gut feeling? Is it an emotional reaction that I'm having? It's like, dig into it, explore it. And like I said, sometimes you discover things that you don't like about like something, but that's room, and that's development, that's growth.
Right. Yes. Growing pains on the left are difficult for some people to take. And building on that, I think it is really just, for some people, it becomes like a rhetorical crutch that they rely on. And that's why I think people have been focusing on this idea of cancel culture so much, because they don't know what to do with themselves. And I've mentioned this before. I've mentioned it in several other podcasts. I've tweeted about it. I've written about it. I think right now what is happening is we're seeing excessive hand-wringing over quote unquote cancel culture, because these people are uncomfortable with the fact that after years and years of saying that race doesn't matter, or it matters, but it's like on the side, and identity politics and blah, 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 and freaking out about that. We have to do class only. That's the only way we're going to get a working class, a multiracial working class built. And we need to go after Trump supporters and all this nonsense that didn't work. And then they're seeing hundreds of thousands of people come out of their homes in the middle of a pandemic to fight police brutality and policing as we know it. And particularly racism, right? Like, they're framing it as an anti-racist project. I think that makes them feel incredibly impotent, because they spent all these years shitting on race politics. And then now what they're seeing erupt in the streets as a galvanizing point to like work around and to fight over, fight for, I should say, is this matter of racial equality. Because what people are saying, and have been saying for freaking centuries at this point, is that class inequality is a huge problem. We need to address it. But as we address that, we can't ignore the ways that racism adds to class inequality and takes away from our ability to mobilize together. If you and I are trying to come together for class equality, and you think of me as less than you, when it comes time for distributing those resources, I know I'm not going to get the same chunk as you, right? You're going to get more than me. And that's going to be a problem. You're going to use an upper class, ruling class, elite framing of society, which is, like hierarchy by race, and you're going to use that elite stratification to defend your right to get more than me, even though we're supposed to be comrades in arms for equal resources and distribution thereof. That's not going to work, right? Because you're using the language and the tools of the elite and operating with those in mind in a project that's supposed to be equal. And if we still have that standing in the way, we're never going to achieve class equality. We're never going to achieve a working class coalition that really works if we have people that are set on destroying Black people, queer people, women, whatever, within that group. It just ain't gonna work. Like once everything is, because this is the thing, people often talk about unions and stuff. Unions are great, but if you read the history of unions in this country, you recognize that there have always been white people, and especially white men, working class or otherwise, who have taken on elite constructions of race and gender and God knows what else, immigration as well. Like, this issue of xenophobia is very, very present in unions. And they've used that kind of discrimination as a means to limit access for people of color and women of color in particular. This is the reality. And women of color and people of color as a whole have had to form alternative unions even. I mean, there's writing about this in the United States as it happened in Detroit and other parts of the Midwest industrialization with Black people. They had to form their own groups in order to get their needs met because they were dealing with so much racism within the unions. Like, don't look me in the face and act like unions are the end all be all to fixing our class inequality problems. We have to fix multiple problems at once. And one of those problems that ended up galvanizing people right now to get out of their homes and risk their literal lives to protest was racism, to be more specific. So there's something happening that people don't want to address because they are afraid, because they now have egg on their faces. I think they're embarrassed because all their nonsense over the years about race doesn't matter, and then they see race matters. It really does matter. And then they want to denigrate it. They want to say they want to talk about something else, is what I'm saying. They're saying that no, they're trying to dictate what we talk about. That's why they're talking about cancel culture every episode they make on Jacobin, on all these other pages. That's all they talk about now, because they don't know what to do with themselves as they watch the freaking world erupt over racist policing. They just don't know. They feel out of place, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Let's rant over.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think one of the things that just kind of came to my mind while you were going on is that I think that race consciousness is a lot higher in this country than class consciousness. So
Absolutely.
like people are far more aware of like the differences between like race and like as we perceive it in this country versus class. And so like there are, people out protesting about rent and some great direct actions in like impeding the ability for people to get evicted. And some of the other economic issues are out there and have people motivated, but it's undeniable that the massive uprising that we saw across the country and continue to see was inspired primarily by race. The racist policing, as you said.
Mm-hmm.
And
those people are not unconcerned with the other stuff too, right? I mean, this is part of it. Like, if you think about the Black Lives Matter and other Black groups activism that's going on in the streets, why are they doing mutual aid? Like, this is a thing that's come up over and over. They're trying to help people who are homeless and people who are newly homeless on top of that, right? Because literally, like, food banks are running out of food. They don't have resources. They don't have money. They can't go buy stuff. These groups are trying to fill in those holes to help people on an economic basis. And they're not just helping Black people, right? Although Black people are being disproportionately hit by COVID and housing inequality and all these things in this country because of reasons we've already talked about ad nauseum. But they are trying to fill in the blanks where our society and our government have fallen and not done their jobs. And so, like, to sit there and act like there's no way for discussions of racism to then also include addressing class inequality, it's just ridiculous, because it's not true. It's literally ahistorical, and against what's happening in the present. Like, you see what's happening in the present, and they want to deny it because they're not the ones out there putting their lives on the line. They're sitting up, posted up in front of their computers or wherever they live, often on, in nice houses and whatever in Brooklyn and LA, and they're telling us that race doesn't matter and none of these movements matter, when those people are actually doing the real work on the ground to help others that they act like doesn't matter. But, whatever. I'm mad. Yes, I'm angry about this. It just
I imagine one question that comes to mind is how is I as a white man, how can I lead this movement of Black lives? Like it's like, oh, that's not going to work. Well, this isn't important. We need to talk about something else, something I
Right.
can be centered in, something I can be the focus of, something I can be, looked to as the most informative source, rather than like, because if you want to be informed about why Black Lives Matter is in the condition that it is, why is these uprising, all those types of things, if you want to get that from people that are understanding of it, you have to go to the sources of other Black voices. It's like, which is not the white guy who is concerned about cancel culture. So like I think there's a material aspect to this as well. It's like that they both can't materially benefit, and then also can't financially benefit, and also can't be seen as a leader in this moment, so long as racism is centered and Black voices are expected to be the most informative on the perspectives at play.
That's right. And there's also literally, like, on the ground, as I said earlier, and I think this is what brings us back to our reading quite a bit. The people who are on the front lines, who are doing a lot of work, at least in terms of the mutual aid stuff, because obviously there are like white people who are literally putting their bodies on the line too, and like, thank God for those people. I appreciate those people doing that. But in terms of people who are doing a lot of the mutual aid stuff, the people that I see in these interviews are Black women. A lot of them are women. Or at least, women, like, presenting as female, right? And I don't know how they personally identify. But in the interviews that I've seen, they're almost all women. A lot of them are queer women. And these are people whose work gets ignored. And as you mentioned earlier, like, once a white guy comes, then maybe they'll pay attention to what they're doing, or it'll kind of validate it for the society, which again goes back to the issue we were talking about before, about like how racism and sexism do actually matter in terms of how we talk about class equality and equality within these movements. But like, you can't deny what's happening. And I think in order, as you said, for them to deny it, they have to reroute the discussion to something where they're the authority, right? And I agree with you 100%. I think that is exactly what's happening. And I think that the answer to that is to continue doing what we're doing in terms of, when I say we, I don't mean me and you necessarily, although I know we are also doing our own part in this fight. But people who are on the ground, who are doing work in these movements, who are helping other people, who are putting their lives on the line, keep doing that. Right now we're seeing people get attacked in the streets and murdered, literally murdered. We saw it, with Charlottesville. We've seen it before, centuries before. We see it in the present over and over and over. We do not have anyone to help us. We're on our own right now. And I think that as a society, and especially on the left, we have to support one another. And that does not look like shitting on people for calling out racism within these movements, because these movements should be where we can go for help. This is where we should have mutual aid. This is where we should have support. And if the place that should be our place of support is abusive, is offensive, is harming people, doesn't care about us, is denigrating us on the basis of our identity, it's not a place where I want to be, right? It's not a place that I consider my political home. And I think for us to establish a more connected and salient left, instead of going the direction that I think is incredibly reactionary, which is telling people to shut the fuck up and not to talk about their issues, where we need to be going instead is saying, how can I help you? How can I do better as a human being that recognizes you as my equal? Where am I falling short? Where can I go as a cisgender woman and do better in recognizing the needs of trans women and men and non-binary people, right? What can I do to help in terms of getting rid of my biases because of the society that I've been raised in, to better work with, respect, and include people like that in my movement, right? That's what I want. And that's the direction that we should be going in. Instead of telling those people to shut up, and that's cancel culture and this and that, which is entirely reactionary, we should be saying, how can I help? How can I do better to make our space more inclusive?
And we should be asking ourselves that first,
right.
Like before we look to, some person of the marginalized community to hold our hand through it. We should be asking ourselves these questions first, doing our own work, digging into our own biases, doing those things long before we're approaching people that are like that are represented in these groups, to ask them to do any of that work for us.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's fine to look at the work that they've already done, and sometimes you can get reference to it from somebody or something. But the idea is, I think, in my opinion, is to do a lot of this work internally first, so that like you're not seen as essentially, oh, well, what do I got to do to be, kind of a in an aggressive or confrontational way. If that makes sense.
Right. Like, and I think what's happening, like something you said kind of sparked this in my head, but like what's being demanded of us right now is make room for my racism, make room for my sexism, make room for my transphobia, instead of make room for Black people, make room for women, make room for trans people. You see what I'm saying? Like,
absolutely.
It's like, this cannot be the direction that we take the left, because that just makes us like the right, and the right is ironically in some ways more inclusive, because they're trying to like clean up their image, right? So they're like, look, we have Black people, look, we have women, look, we have queer people, right? They're trying to make themselves out to be more inclusive than the left. And unfortunately, and I see this in Brazil too a lot, because what they do is they'll appoint people of color, women, et cetera, into these like higher positions. So even though they're also fascists, it looks nicer because they're like, oh, but look, we have, like, they turn identity politics on its head and try to use them as tokens, right? And instead, I think what the left should be answering with is, we want more diversity in our ranks. We want more women. We want more people of color. We want more queer people and trans people, because we value their perspectives in this fight. And we want them to be leaders in our movement, because they can really show us exactly where we need to focus our energies to make sure that everyone is pulled up and equal. That's what we should be doing. And instead, I think people are reacting. Ironically, it's like they're trying to outright the right. And I'm not sure why that is, other than all I can say is grifting and intentional disregard for their fellow leftists, their fellow comrades. There's something wrong. And I don't know. I think that there are many directions that the left should be going in right now that they're unfortunately dropping the ball on, and they're going to continue to lose more and more people. And when I say left, I'm talking about the real left, like socialists and Marxists and communists and stuff. I'm not talking about liberals, but I think liberals as well are prime. They're like ripe for the picking in terms of turning them into into comrades. I think there is some potential there. And I think the potential is in the fact that you do see some, I'm not talking about establishment liberals, like hard establishment people. I'm talking about liberal voters. And you see people coming out and voting for Black, brown, Muslim, whatever, fill in the blank ethnic group and racial group, religious group. They're voting for those people with their socialist agendas, right? So they're voting for people like Ilhan Omar. They're voting for people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They're voting for Jamal Bowman, because they see, I think on the one hand, they first of all are looking at the identity stuff, right? They're saying, I see someone like me in a position of power. That's what I want. I want someone who's gone through what I've gone through, who can reflect my concerns and really represent me. So they are looking at this identity stuff, right? They're looking at that. And at the same time, it's almost like a Trojan horse to push forward socialist agendas. And so I think and I don't like framing it like that, but that's the reality, right? Because you saw when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was first elected, people were really excited about her who were like Clintonites. There were people who liked Hillary Clinton who also liked Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, because those same women, mainly women, had been complaining that, oh, all I see is old white men getting in office. And so she was exciting because she bucked against that tradition on what we would, on some people on the left would call a superficial level, right? It's just identity. But that matters, because then she was someone who could get in there, and regardless of what complaints we have about her, because she has her own issues, right? There are definitely some stuff on foreign policy and things like that where I'm like, what are you doing? But I think just on a basic level, she has been an advocate for a lot of things and been outspoken about a lot of things, and people like her have been outspoken about a lot of things. Rashida Tlaib, especially, Ilhan Omar, especially, where they have been able to say things that I think that people can't check them on, because it's like y'all complained and said you wanted more diversity. So here's your diversity. You got it. And now I'm going to use this as a way to push for a better left agenda, at least something that's marginally better than what we have in liberals and the establishment Democrats. I think that there's potential there, and I think that that's what we should be taking advantage of. Like, play the game and turn it on its head and say, all right, you want diversity, here's your diversity, and now I'm going to talk about class inequality. Like, I don't know. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Am I crazy for thinking that? Like, is this not an avenue that we should pursue?
I mean, I think it's somewhat natural. Like, I mean, I feel like it's just kind of, if it's not deceptive in that way, it's kind of up front, it's like, I'm campaigning on these issues, and these are the issues, and I might not use certain terms that might, set people off or whatever, but the clear kind of undercurrent of kind of, at least at minimum, social democratic, if not democratic socialist policy is there. And so it doesn't feel deceitful to me. So I feel like it's just a matter of, it disarms a angle of attack, and we've seen this before. I mean, it was used against Bernie Sanders essentially, and his supporters, to varying degrees of accuracy, but that it was basically a white male leftist or white male movement, and this is what white males want, and this is a white male thing. So when you put a politician like AOC or Ilhan Omar or anybody else up there, Jamal Bowman, you disarm that angle of attack.
Right, for sure. And it's something, I don't know, I think that people should continue pressing on that front and push for even further left policies. Because as I said, these people are okay, like they're good compared to what we have now. But we need to go further than that.
There's a lot of space between where we are now and my ideals, but like, right. Like there's also quite a bit of distance between even folks like AOC and just your run-of-the-mill liberal Democrat. Like, there's quite a bit of space there. And that's there is some substance there, and to me, I subscribe to the concept of non-reformist reforms, and so like there are things that you can do that could potentially improve the conditions in which the revolution can manifest, while also not getting everything you want.
Right. And speaking of things that we want, I want to go back to the reading really quickly, because I just wanted to touch on something that I think was interesting. In part 4, which is the last, I think it's the last section. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The last section towards the end, last couple of pages, they lay out sort of their platform, which is also something that's left out of many discussions of this particular document. That at the end, they lay out sort of what they see their job as doing within these movements, things that they're pressing for that they feel would disproportionately affect women of color, and Black women in particular, poor Black women. And I think that the reason I'm bringing it up now is because we were talking about, socialist agendas that are pushed by people of color, women of color, et cetera, who sort of buck the trends of the neoliberal establishment, even while trying to operate within that system. Although I think that there's some discussion to be had on whether or not there can be successes in that way and through electoralism as a whole. Again, we've kind of had in other discussions here and there, but I think that this part is cool because they lay out some of the things that they see as not just benefiting Black women, but like as a result, if you can benefit the Black women and third world working people, that it will benefit the society as a whole and make for a much more equitable society, and like one that functions better because you have a more equal and cared for working class. And so they say here, the quote, "The inclusiveness of our politics makes us concerned with any situation that impinges upon the lives of women, third world, and working people. We are, of course, particularly committed to working on those struggles in which race, sex, and class are simultaneous factors in oppression. We might, for example, become involved in workplace organizing at a factory that employs third world women, or picket a hospital that is cutting back on already inadequate healthcare to a third world community, or set up a rape crisis center in a Black neighborhood. Organizing around welfare and daycare concerns might also be a focus. The work to be done and the countless issues that this work represents merely reflect the pervasiveness of our oppression. And so I really like that part, because they're saying, like, look, we have to have a holistic approach when it comes to resources and addressing our needs. And I really, I don't know, I appreciate that. And I think it's something that we have to also think about, because when we talk about, you know, for example, Medicare for all, okay, Medicare for all we need, and I'm all for it. I, of all people, need it a lot. You know, I have MS, I have asthma, I have a baby. There are all these things that I need to go to the doctor a lot, you know. But I also recognize that, like, there are certain issues within healthcare that also need to be fixed. You know, there are issues of racism and sexism, linguistic barriers, all sorts of stuff. Classism as well, right? Because they often say that when poor people go to the hospital, they deal with a lot of mistreatment. And that's, of course, it's like deepened and worsened by factors of racism and sexism and the like. So, like, how do we, on the one hand, address a major deficit in our society in terms of healthcare, but also make sure that healthcare is equal, and also make sure that the healthcare is, like, holistic and supports the entire community, not just, you know, a couple of groups. And same goes with unionization, same goes with childcare, same goes with, you know, college for all, right? Making sure that people are not just getting support in college, but making sure that they're graduating from high school, making sure that they're educated in a way that they're prepared for college, etc. So there are all these additional steps that we have to keep pushing on. And I think that sometimes people get stuck at one place because we don't have that one thing. They're like, we've got to focus on this one thing. We don't have time for all these, like, all this minutia. But it's not minutia, right? Like, it's not minutia to ask to make sure that, like, the system that we're fighting for is a system that's going to operate to address all of our needs. I think that's, like, part and parcel with like social struggle, right? We don't want to half-ass this. We need the whole thing. And I think that asking for the whole thing is where we need to start, instead of starting with a compromise of, like, well, we're good with Medicare for all, but we're not going to address all these other problems. Like, let's address the whole beast and then go from there, you know, like, get what we can from there, instead of just starting with the compromise point. But I think that they're kind of addressing that here. They're trying to say, like, what can we do to fill in all of the gaps?
Yeah, and it's important, because just getting access to Medicare or to healthcare isn't going to resolve the disproportionate deaths during giving birth, or the like not being listened to by doctors, or like any of the other aspects that are critical to not just, like, the comfort but the survival of Black women. And to have them marginalized is an injustice for all of us.
Absolutely. And I think too, like, this can be extended. I think that's what's the cool thing about the document, is that it feels like a living document, right? Where you can always add in more to it, like, not just Black women, because obviously, as I said, they're dealing with Black, queer, cisgendered women, but we can always add in, like, what about trans women? What about, you know, they kind of they talk a lot about third world women and third world workers, but, like, what would a document like this sound like for, like, Dalit women in India who are workers and who are neglected and abused on the basis of their caste, right? There are all these sorts of parallels that we can draw and apply from this document to other groups. And I think that's what's so cool about it. And I wish that more people read it. I mean, I read it in college, actually, for a class, and I kind of never thought about it again until recently, with everything coming up all the time where it was being discussed, and this idea of identity politics kept coming up, and people didn't know what the hell they were talking about. And I think that there is a kind of, I'm going to just say it outright, I think that the reason identity politics as a term and an idea is so distorted is precisely for the exact reasons that these women are fighting, like this bias against Black women within the left. And I think that that's why their ideas are not taken seriously, or if they are taken seriously, they're distorted to the point where they're so far removed from what they actually meant that it's not the same idea anymore. And they have to keep trying to rehabilitate the original meaning because they're not being listened to. Like, this is literally like the as I keep saying, the idea of identity politics on the left is what we're actually talking about is the distortion and subsequent weaponization and co-optation by liberals of identity politics. That's not the same as identity politics, right? So
yes, it'd be nice if we could just, there should be some shorthand for this.
Yeah, right. Like not a whole sentence, but it's
but
like
that's a critical point that I've felt had to be made multiple times and will continue to have to be made, I think.
Yeah, and then maybe we should come up with another. I think what's going to have to happen eventually is that we're either going to have to come up with another term for identity politics, like the original meaning, or we're going to have to come up, and this is my preference, we're going to have to come up with another term for the weaponization and distortion of identity politics by liberals. That's what we're going to have to do. And I don't know what that terminology is, but right now I'm not satisfied with the distortion version, and I recognize its flaws, but at the same time I think that sometimes when people talk about identity politics on the left, they use it as a kind of dog whistle in conjunction with this cancel culture nonsense, as a way to kind of be like, y'all are taking up too much space talking about your issues, and we just want to talk about the issues that only affect us, and that's the problem. It's just a problem. I don't know. But anyway, last thoughts, Richard. I'll let you close it out. What are your any final thoughts about the Combahee River Collective Statement that you wanted to leave us with?
Just thankful for them taking the time to write it down, and document it. And it's inspiring, and in some ways I feel like even if I don't literally write something like this, just kind of organizing my own perception in a statement like this kind of thing would be helpful, I feel. And like as you mentioned, you can build on this. I feel like I could essentially borrow a lot from this to help kind of construct that in a way that would give me kind of a comprehensive understanding of my own politic, and like where it's coming from and where I want it to be. And so I find it inspirational in that way, especially. And so I guess that's my final bit.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you all for listening to us go through this and also have a lot of tangents. Well, they're not tangents. They were related to what we read. It's just been a lot. Like, I feel like lately it's been, it's been difficult kind of navigating like the reality on the street and then the nonsense that we see with some people online on the left. It's like the complete disconnect from reality has been jarring, I think. And I felt like we needed to kind of address it by using historical documents that are dealing with the same issues, So yeah, I really appreciate you reading this with me and being on the tape, going through it.
Thank you, and thank everybody that listened to us and is working through these things and that's going to read this and like just help use this, either the recording or the text itself, to grow and help kind of grow the left in the way that Wendi was talking about. Just thanks.
And yes, thank you. And also just a reminder to everyone, if you haven't had a chance to look at it or find it, you can find the link to the full text. It's only about, like I said, like 11, it's about 11 to 12 pages or so. You can find it on our Patreon page, and that's patreon.com/LeftPOC. Everything over there is always free for the public. And you can also find it linked on our Twitter page, our Facebook page, blah, 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 and also in the show notes of this actual episode. And if you happen to have any questions or comments you wanted to leave about the podcast or about the reading itself, feel free to do that on our Patreon or on social media, and we will do our best to respond to it, your commentary or your question in the next segment, or like the next episode or the next reading revolution that we do, which is coming up next month. We'll release the document that we're going to read for next month soon. It is a zinger, folks, so be ready. It's a spicy one. Spicy because oppression is always bland, and we got to spice it up a little bit. So. By challenging it. I'm old and tired, as you can tell. Anyway, thank you all so much. Have a good one, everyone.
See ya.
Thank you for listening to the LeftPOC Project podcast. You can find more about the podcast by visiting us on social media and searching for LeftPOC, or by checking out our Patreon, where our content is always free, but we welcome donations, by visiting patreon.com/LeftPOC. Thanks again, and have a good one.